Hi everyone, welcome back to Active Mobility Online with me, your host, Coach Garrett. In this video, we're going to cover technique for the squat. There are lots of different ways to do squats: wide stance, narrow stance, weighted, unweighted. That weight can be behind you, in front of you, a lot of different objects. Know that the basic technique that we're going to focus on today should apply to all those different types of squats, and that the different squats are all great. They should contribute to your strength in different ways, and it's good to be able to do squats a lot of different ways. Okay, so I want to cover three basic points of technique around the squat. The first and the second are really how you start your squat. How you start your squat is going to affect how your squat is overall. So the first is thinking about pelvis and low back. In general, we want to set up for our squat at the top. We want to get our low back and pelvis really neutral. You can think of your pelvis as a bowl. We don't want to be spilling that bowl forward, nor do we necessarily want that bowl to be spilling back. And then the low back really plugs into the pelvis in a very integral way, so where your pelvis goes, your low back is likely to follow. So when we set up for our squat, we want to think about engaging our glutes, screwing your feet into the floor, and tightening down the front of your body. More on that in a future video on bracing and the bracing sequence. But we want to find neutral. Sometimes activating the glutes, screwing the feet into the floor, will just tend to bring your pelvis under you in a way that will get your low back neutral and your pelvis nice and neutral. So we don't want to be sort of lazy through the front and allow that pelvis to dump forward to begin our squat, nor do we want to sort of have this pressed way through with our hips actually coming forward and that pelvis going way under us and tucking the tailbone up. We want to think about tightening through the front, getting the pelvis nice and level. So that's our first point. Second point is once we've gotten to that, we want to really load the posterior chain first by moving the hips back and hinging at the hips first. So once we're in that brace neutral position, our pelvis is neutral, our low back is neutral, we want the first movement to occur at the hips by sending the hips back. We have to hold on to tension through the front of our body so that we don't send the hips back at the cost of that neutral low back. But we want to load up the glutes, hamstring, and back first, because what we load first is going to take more of the load, and the hips are a more robust part of the body than our knees are. So sending the hips back is going to bias the weight towards the hips. So we want to do that first. Pelvis neutral, hinge at the hips to begin our squat. From there, once we've sort of gotten those pieces out of the way, a lot is going to go right with our squat, no matter what. But thinking about as we go down and up, holding onto that pelvic low back relative neutral, holding onto that tension through the front of the body to maintain that, we also want to think about weight being balanced in the foot. So big toe, little toe, heel should all share the weight. The weight should be centered in the foot. And anytime we go where we get a little bit more weight on the big toe or a little bit more weight on the little toe, or more far forward or more far back, that's going to tell us that something is happening with our squat that we probably don't want to happen. So if I start with a neutral stance, get everything as neutral as I can, tight through the front of my body, send my hips back first. I'm going to think about pressing my knees out just a little bit or having my knees track towards my pinky toes. That's what I think about to help keep the weight balanced in my foot. As I continue to lower, I'm paying attention that I'm not diving in, putting weight on the big toe. I'm not pressing so far out that that big toe starts to feel like it's going to peel off. And then as I get down towards the bottom, I'm continuing to have weight in my heel so I'm not rocking forward, putting more stress on the knee. So even at the bottom of my squat, I want my weight to be coming right down through the center of my foot, balanced in each of those corners of the foot, big toe, little toe, heel. All right, so some cues. I want to dive into some cues that we hear or that we get coached with. First is weight in the heels. So weight in the heels can be a good cue to give people if they're hinging at the hips and putting their weight forward, or if as they get down to the bottom of the squat, they're actually coming up off their heels or putting more weight in the front. It may not be that their heels are actually coming off, but we don't necessarily want the weight to be in the heel more than we want it to be in the middle of the foot. But that cue, weight in the heels, will sort of fix some problems that people will find if they're pushing their knees forward first, or if they find that they're not getting their weight or loading up the posterior chain first. So that can be a helpful cue, but it's not that we necessarily want the weight on the heels. The next is hips back. So we're trying to get at, when we hear that cue, hips back, we're trying to get at that hinge in the hips first, but what tends to happen is sometimes people will put the hips back and leave the chest where it where it is. So hinging through the spine as opposed to just hinging through the hips. So losing that tension in the front is something that can happen there. So hips back is just another cue to try to load the posterior chain at the start. Knees out is one that we hear a lot, and knees out can be a good cue if people are letting the knees collapse in. But what we're really trying to get at is that weight balanced in the foot, big toe, little toe, and heel. So if we can focus on that, knees out may still be a good cue if it's fixing a problem. But what we're looking at mostly is that the knees follow the same path down as up. So we're trying not to have a lot of waving in and out. In fact, as the knee moves in and then out in the middle of the squat, it's actually putting weird forces on the pelvis, the hips. That can translate into forces on the low back that we want to avoid. What you'll tend to see is people will be fine on the way down, and then if things are heavy, the knees will dive in trying to find like another gear to get out of the hole. And that people may be able to do that for a long time without injury, but it's not ideal. Okay, so consistent tracking, we want the knee to go down on the same path down as up, and we don't want a whole lot of wobble in and out. So that's where that cue knees out can come from. Some faults that we see with the squat, I already talked about these more or less throughout the video, is dumping or hinging in that low back, dumping the pelvis forward instead of keeping tension in that brace neutral and setting the hips back as you hinge to load the posterior chain first. Sometimes people who are a lot less experienced with the squat or have not learned to squat in a gym setting, sometimes we'll have the knees go forward first and then try to catch up with the hips. Anytime, any movement or any joint that we move first gets loaded more than the rest of the body. So if we press the knees forward first in the squat, it tends to load up the quads and it puts a lot of extra pressure on the knees. And even if you start to hinge through the hips on your way down, it still is putting a lot more pressure on the knees than loading the hips and hamstrings and back first. Finally, that knee collapsing inwards, the arches collapsing happens sometimes. It can be a tool that people use to get deeper in the squat. Toes can come out, and then as you get down towards the bottom, they're finding more depth by allowing the knees to go in, allowing the arches to collapse in. But that's at the cost of a lot of stability and putting ankles and knees and hips all in a more vulnerable place. So we want to try to avoid that valgus collapse or that knee collapsing in. Next video will be some drills to help you strengthen your squat. And then the last video will be mobility to help you get into that deeper squat, if that's your goal, in a way that is strong and stable.